Hello, I'm Joseph Janisch.
Hello, I'm Zach Frieseke.
I'm David Janisch.
Hi, I'm Dr. Janisch.
All right, Grandpa. So, do you think you could just give us a brief introduction, like what's your birthday, where'd you grow up, are you married or not?
Well, okay. I was born in the roaring 20s, and within a year after I was born, the Great Depression came, and which affected our lives grossly after that, growing up. For example, this is a neighborhood that we lived in. It was called Sherman Park. Now, we didn't refer to it as Sherman Park at the time. It was just where we lived. But Sherman Park was about four short blocks to the east of the house that we lived in. And about 4 blocks to the west of it was Sherman School. So there was Sherman Boulevard, Sherman Park, and Sherman School in the area. So the calling it Sherman Park neighborhood was, of course, totally appropriate. But that was where we grew up. This poster was a glorification, a depiction of what our bungalow looked like. The neighborhood that we lived in was a post-World War I neighborhood. It was comprised primarily of bungalows and what are today called duplexes in those two-level house. And we called them flats at the time. That was the parlance of the day. And that was where we had lived. The house that we lived in, that we moved in shortly after I was born, which was a couple of years after the Great Depression had started, was a home. My parents could not afford to buy a home, so we lived in a small rented house. My brother, sister, my mom, and my dad. And that house was called a bungalow. It was a very inexpensive home, and of significance was the fact that it was owned by a building and loan, today called Savings and Loan Company, because it was a home that had been lost in the Depression when many people out of work. And the house was put on the market for sale by the Savings and Loan every year until we moved out, which was approximately 11 years later. But during the Depression, of course, you see there were very few people who had full-time jobs, and consequently there weren't a lot of buyers for a home. But one of the significant things that I recall was my older brother, who was 7 years older than I, and he was very disturbed about the fact that every spring the real estate company would nail a sign onto the house. And because it was a foreclosure, they wanted to sell it, but it never sold. So we continued to live there for an 11-year period of time. And my brother, one year, he was about 10 years old or so at the time, and he was so disturbed that the house was going to be sold again that he ripped the sign off the front of the house. And I remember my mom and dad, of course, were very upset that he had torn the sign down. They didn't put signs in those days on a stake and put it on the lawn. They nailed them to the side of the house so they could be seen by everybody going past. So that was where, shortly after, do you want me to continue further with where we lived?
I was going to ask you about what was life like growing up during that beginning of the early Depression?
Well, my father was employed. He was in the automobile business, and he was employed very sporadically because, of course, the car business was greatly depressed during the Depression, with few people having the resources to buy and to repair cars. And one of the things that it did was the neighborhood that we lived in, there was public transportation very close to where we we lived. So we were able to, any place we ever went ever was on a streetcar or a bus. And there was a bus on Sherman Boulevard, there was a bus on Burleigh, and that was 4 or 5 houses from where we lived, and another bus on Center Street, which was 3 blocks in the other direction. So we always had a transportation no matter where we went. And growing up during the Depression, just the effects of the lack of money, etc., was significant to our lives. Our family had to be very good. My father's income was sporadic. He did work at home. He repaired cars in a dirt floor garage in order to keep the family in food, and that's the way it was. So aside transportation issues, the only way to get along was on public transportation, etc.
You mentioned the streetcars. Did you use those a lot?
Oh yes, that was what you used to go anywhere, was a streetcar or a bus. There was, on one side there was a gas bus on Sherman Boulevard. There was a Sherman Boulevard bus which went downtown, which were where all the stores were at the time, and so that's how you got around.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I just have a question. You mentioned going places with the streetcars. Growing up, what are some things that you did for fun?
Oh yeah. Well, spent a lot of time growing up at the playground in the summertime, and the park. The park was only 4 blocks away, and there was ice skating at the park.
Was this Sherman Park?
Sherman Park, right. It was on Sherman Boulevard and Burleigh. And spent a lot of time at the park and the playground, because they were both places that I think that joining the playground was something like 50 cents for the summer, something like that. So consequently, it could be afforded. So, but you did things that you could get to by public transportation, essentially.
Did you ever do anything did you ever go downtown for events?
Oh yes. Most of the shopping was downtown. There were no such things as shopping malls such as we all know today and we have grown up with. And particularly you have grown up with. There was no Highway 100. That was out in the country, and so there was no mall type stores. So all the shopping was downtown. Not food and hardware and things like that were on the business streets in the neighborhood. And but any shopping that my mother had to do, she took the bus downtown to do it. So
yeah, so kind of going back to middle school and high school.
Right.
What was it like going to school? Kind of end of the Depression, beginning of World War II.
Well, I can we go back to start with Pearl Harbor, which was essentially the beginning of the war. I was in 8th grade at the time at Steuben Junior High School, which is a high school that you pass. It's now a German immersion school on 52nd and North Avenue. And when the war started, it was in December 7th, of course, as you know, on Pearl Harbor Day. And at that time, the Monday, that was on a Sunday, on the Monday, of course, we all sat quietly in our homerooms or whatever, and we listened to no television, of course, so we listened to the radio. We listened to the Congress in the declaration of war against Japan, and that was the start. Now, just a sidelight to show you what happened. In 8th grade at the time, the language that I was taking was German, and then the war was declared against Nazi Germany a few days after the declaration of war against Japan. So being in German class wasn't very popular in a sense, because they had become our international enemies and in the war. And so I dropped, when I got to ninth grade, a semester later, I switched my language major over to Spanish. It was easier than German anyhow, but we lived in a German neighborhood. And so therefore there was a lot of German being spoken. But at any rate, I dropped it and took Spanish at the time. And that happened to a lot of people. German as a language study in high school had declined precipitously.
So after high school, what did you end up doing?
Well, I graduated, I was quite young at the time, and I had, the end of the war happened with Hiroshima, with the atomic bombing, and that was in August of 1945. And I graduated from high school then in January of the following year, which was 1946. So I had spent virtually my entire high school career during the war. My brother was in the Air Force at the time, my older brother, and we did things on Saturday afternoons like collect aluminum and collect papers for the war service and all that kind of thing. And so that's life kind of centered around that. So
I know in our pre-interview you talked about seeing Carl Zeidler outside of your school one time. Can you just tell us what that was like?
Sure. You've passed the area a number of times where Steuben Junior High School was in ninth grade at the time. And this young man, I think he was in his early 30s at the time, that would be my guess now, ran for mayor against Mayor Hohen, who had been the socialist mayor for 26 years in the city of Milwaukee. And Carl Zeidler ran against him. And I recall being in junior high, at lunch hour, we'd walk over to an ice cream store, whatever, for nickel ice cream cones. And Carl Zeidler, of that famous family, was making a speech on the steps of the church across the street. So we all went to listen to Carl Zeidler's election speech. His younger brother, Frank Zeidler, then had been elected. He was, I think, a 12 or 16-year mayor during the 50s and into the 60s. And you have perhaps read some of his material now in your Wisconsin class. But that was kind of exciting to see a candidate, et cetera, et cetera.
What did you think of the socialist era? Like, did you support what they were doing with the city, or?
Well, I did not really have strong political feelings at that point, not at age 12 or whatever I was at that time, 14. Did not have strong political feelings. Mayor Hohen, the 26-year socialist mayor of the city, we really, as I was born while he was mayor, I did not have a sensitivity to political positions. It was just not something you gave a lot of attention to as a kid. You're more interested in playing baseball or something, or playing in the playground than political feelings. But there are a lot of the city at that point, Milwaukee had been. Well, here's a typical thing that happened. During the Great Depression, of course, there was not a lot of money by the city, because collection of taxes was very difficult, et cetera, et cetera. So improvements to city transportation, to schools, to those were all held back. Now, typically what happened was in 1946, I happened to be in the service at that time, but while I was in service, there was a monster snowstorm. It was early in 1947, not 46, and the city did not have a sufficient number of good snow removal trucks and equipment. So the city got literally shut down, schools closed, businesses closed, etc. because I think it was almost a 2-week period when people didn't go to work, where they didn't work, kids didn't go to school because the streets were totally jammed with this huge snowfall. I think it was around a 20-inch snowfall at that point. And so because of that lack of money to buy new snowplows, it happened. Typically a wartime type experience, lack of money.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know, like, you said you didn't have, obviously growing up, you didn't have too much of, like, a big view on, like, the socialism. But, like, was it definitely, like, present, the changes that they were making in the city?
Would you repeat that, Zach, please?
Yes, with, like, the socialism, like, with the time that you're growing up, like, was it visibly present, the changes that they were making in the city?
Well, what was visibly present about it was there were, and you have heard of these perhaps in your local history, but there were agencies created by the New Deal of Roosevelt at the time, and they were the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where they put young people to work of your age in parks and etc. Good example of the CCC. When you go down to Hart Park, in which all of you have spent a lot of time at, I'm sure, if you'll notice there are limestone walls along the sides of the rivers in that area. That was all done by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Hart Park buildings were built by the WPA. And that was a public organization, a socialist organization, if you would like to call it that. And they built those, and there were along Honey Creek Parkway on up through the golf course in this area and along all the way out to the south side. You will find structures that were built by the WPA and the CCC, and they were, of course, the socialist organizations. But it was all very visible, the parks, etc.
Yeah. Growing up in this time, did you have a job growing up, and like what were your working conditions like?
Okay, the first job I had was at approximately 12, and I became a caddy. And my brother had been a caddy and were kind of interested in golf. And we caddied friends and I caddied at a golf course in just this side of Menominee Falls, and we would hitchhike from 60th and Burleigh, which was the outskirts of the city. We would hitchhike there, and that was the first job. That was for 2 years. And then after that, at age 14, when I was in high school, I became a clerk in a drugstore and worked in a couple of different drugstores. And then later on in high school, when I became 16, I became eligible for a job in a factory and railroads and things of which they had to use young people for this because the young men were gone. And so I worked for the Milwaukee Road in the freight department and unloaded and loaded freight cars. Another place I worked was at a packing plant in the valley near where Potawatomi Bingo is now, and it was at what was called Plankington Packing, and it was a company that made sausages, etc. And then, of course, during high school, continuing to work in drugstores and working on these jobs in retail, worked, as I was telling you about, both your grandmother and I working at Gimbel's on the picture over here, because we could get those jobs as 16-year-olds. And then driving a truck for a florist and delivering flowers to funeral homes and places like that around the city. And that was the last major job, and I was 17 and went into service. At that point, went into the Army.
You mentioned working at Gimbel's. Do you remember when Gertie the Duck was going on?
Yes. It was primarily in the papers. I can't state the year specifically. I would guess it was 43 or 44, Joe?
I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head.
Okay, so it was around that time. And the picture of that bridge is the one right here where Gertie the Duck was. It had lots of publicity. So yes, I remember Gertie.
All right, so after the military service, did you come back to Milwaukee?
Yes, and I started college here in 1947 as a freshman at what is now called University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on the east side.
What was it before University?
It was various things. It was called Milwaukee State Teachers College, and there were a whole series of them around the state, Whitewater and Stevens Point and Oshkosh, and that they were all called teachers' colleges. They taught more than education, but that's what they were called. Then eventually they became University of Wisconsin branches. So.
Okay, so what did when you were there at UWM? What did you study?
Educate. Well, I studied my major area was in the social studies, and it was in geology. And I was thinking at that point, well, maybe I'd go into oil industry at the time because a friend of mine did. And that was my major. But then, of course, English and everything else that went along with it. And got a degree in education. And my first job was in a community called Wauwatosa, which at that time had one high school. And I taught math there to begin.
So has the UWM campus changed since when you went there?
The population of the campus, to give you an idea of the degree of change, at that point that your grandmother and I were undergrads, was maybe 2,500 plus a lot of evening graduate students like there are now. Today it's 25 or 27,000 students. So has it changed? Unrecognizable.
So, and then after your undergrad, did you go to get a master's?
Yes, a few years later I got a master's degree, and that was, I started it at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, but the degree came from the University of Wisconsin-Madison because they didn't have that specific degree that I wanted, which was in psychology. And I wanted that degree, but could only get it through Madison.
And then after your master's, I know you got a PhD at Marquette.
Yes.
What was it like going from UWM to Marquette?
Approximately the same. They were both, UWM was much larger. And as a school at the time, Marquette was around, had a gross population, a student population of around 12 or 14,000 possibly, and in UWM at that point was well over 20,000, so it was a little bit smaller, but you didn't notice much difference really.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, so obviously in Milwaukee, like breweries are like a big thing. Like, what was that environment like, and like how has it changed? Yes,
there were at the time in the post area, post World War I, into when the Depression was in, and then liquor or beer and etc. could be manufactured again after what was called Prohibition, which you have probably studied when it was illegal, etc. There were, at that point, there were 4 or 5 major breweries, and they would be like Miller is today, a huge installation like that. The second largest, actually the largest, was Schlitz, and Schlitz Brewery on 3rd Street and off Walnut was at one point was the largest brewery in the United States, larger than St. Louis. Name of the brewery there. Larger than. Then there was Pabst in Milwaukee, which was the 3rd largest. Then Blatz. Blatz was a smaller brewery, and then there were smaller ones around, not like craft breweries, but regular production breweries. And that was called Independent Brewery on the south side. It produced a beer called Braumeister. And then in the valley, there was a factory near Miller, which was called Gettelman, which you have probably seen going through the area. So there were 4 nationwide breweries and a couple of smaller breweries at that point. So,
Yeah, a big thing back around that time were like beer gardens and like a lot of places to go on Sundays to drink beer and hang out with friends. Did you ever partake in any of that?
no, at that point, the beer gardens did not exist as they do today when I was growing up. The beer gardens are a relatively recent thing. They had been, the beer gardens had been popular at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s. There were beer gardens around in what is now near Estabrook Park and places like that. But there were none when we were young. That's a relatively recent development again.
So, Grandpa, were you a sports fan when you were growing up?
Well, I what?
Were you a sports fan?
Yeah, to a degree. There was no Major League Baseball at that time when I was growing up. There was a minor league team called the Milwaukee Brewers, by the way, which was adopted later on by the current team. And in 1953, a major league team baseball came to Milwaukee, and they were called the Milwaukee Braves, and who moved out a few years after that. But that's when sports became big. And the Green Bay Packers, for example, played half their home schedule in Milwaukee, and they played at County Stadium, which preceded Miller Park, and they also played at another place out in the front of the grandstands at State Fair Park. And then all the teams became kind of big time, but they were not there when we were growing up.
So I know we were talking before in the pre-interview about some of the Braves players. Do you have any stories about like Warren Spahn or Eddie Matthews?
Yeah, at that point, when we were young, we would buy tickets which by the way cost about $3 at that point. We would buy tickets, and we would buy them for Sunday doubleheaders today, which are unknown in Major League Baseball. But we'd pick out games that we wanted to see, like the Chicago Cubs and so forth and so on. And we would go and go to the ballpark and sit there all afternoon in a doubleheader in two 9-inning games and watch them. And at one point, I was a volunteer usher for Packer games out at State Fair Park, where I didn't have to buy the ticket then. There was no Major League Basketball at the time. Basketball was more played regionally in the country before air travel got to be so wide. And
so we were talking before about Warren Spahn. I believe he lived in the Highlands.
Yes, just for example, we're talking about how local things were. Warren Spahn, who was generally considered to be probably the best left-hander in baseball history, played for the Milwaukee Braves here, and he lived very close to where, at the south end of the Highlands, where the hardware store, now an Ace Hardware, is on 68th, before you go down the hill down to the grocery stores and that. And Warren lived in a house up on that hill on 68th and Milwaukee Avenue. And he would walk to the stadium on days he wasn't pitching. And kids, and some of them from around here, would go to his house and go to where he lived and hike with him down to the stadium before the game. Another case of being local, Eddie Matthews, who was an all-star and Hall of Fame third baseman, lived off a street that we lived on, which at that time was on the west side of Brookfield. And he lived there. He had married a girl from Wisconsin, and they lived there and had their children there. And that was typical, where the players on the major league teams lived in the area. Not all of them, and not all year round, but a goodly number of them did. And so they lived locally among the people, so you had occasional contact with them, which was an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
So,
Speaking of like famous people, do you remember seeing Dick Bacon around?
yes, we're talking about Dick Bacon, who was famous for nothing, I guess, other than for having the deepest, darkest tan in Milwaukee history. Used to be at Bradford Beach, and he would sit in an enclosure that he had, a cardboard enclosure that he had covered with aluminum foil, so that it would reflect the sunlight and give him a deeper tan.
Oh, yes.
He was famous, but very local, to say the least.
So I remember you went to Marquette, right? So do you remember when they tore down this really like majestic house?
Sure.
I forget the name of it off the top of my head. Do you remember?
Yeah, I don't. It'll come to me after, if you give me some chance to think about it. It was on Wisconsin Avenue, and if you know where the Commons is, the student union, where it is now, it was in front of the student union and next to, in that area where the Varsity Theater is on about 15th and Wisconsin Avenue, and off 16th there's now a dormitory which was torn down. But that home that you're referring to, I'll think of the name, but it was owned by a Milwaukee family, a very palatial home. There was a lot of objection to tearing it down because people thought it was an integral part of the Marquette campus, but it really wasn't. It was just a good-looking house.
Yeah.
All right. So I just have a question. Like, obviously, growing up in like the Depression, like how low the wages were.
Sure.
Like, how did that change along with like the inflation that took place?
And wartime. Okay. The wages at that time, I'll just give you an example. And that the first job that I had in working in a drugstore at age 14, we worked from 5 to 10 in the evening, and we paid $1 for that 5-hour period of time. And so it was 20 cents an hour. Okay, but when we got a job later on at age 16, a job, for example, at Gimbel's, the one that I mentioned, was 37.5 cents an hour. And you might be thinking that half cent was unusual, but that was the way wages were in that era. And then later on, after the war, things began to rise and went up to 50 cents and up to 75 cents, up to $1. And then one of the jobs that I remembered having in college was at about $1.50 an hour, working nights, by the way, at a tannery off Commerce Street. So, but that was later on.
Yeah. So
Right.
after you went and got your education,
Yeah.
obviously you started a more professional career. Do you think you could just tell us about that?
How at the time you start, okay, when I graduated from college, there was it was a time that there were the post-war baby boom was beginning, and there were many children being born in that post-World War II era. And families got larger. Well, just to give you an example, population of the United States at that point was around 120 million. Today it's 320 million, 325 million today. And the population grew typically from 115,000 to 320 million. And it was progressively over the baby boom and into the present day. And so there were many jobs to be had, particularly in the field of education, because there were so many children being born. the baby boom children, of which your parents were all probably, I don't know about yours, Zach, but the boys are, their father was born as a baby boomer during the period of time. It was a 20-year period after Hiroshima. And so consequently, there were many jobs. And so when you were graduating, you could interview and apply and be accepted by an innumerable number of jobs. It all depended where you wanted to live. And you could make that decision. My sister, for example, who graduated 2 years before I did, happened to walk by the placement office, and they were interviewing people for Seattle. And so she took the interview, and they hired her immediately, and she went to Seattle. And that was very typical. So at that point, your grandmother took a job in the city of Milwaukee at a school on the far north side off Silver Spring. And I took a job at Waukesha High School, as I had mentioned to you before. So that was how we got into it. And we applied. I never even filled out, just to show you how it was, I never even filled out a paper, and there were no internet, of course, but I never even filled out an application for the job. I was just hired. They said, okay, you look like you're a reasonable guy, we'll hire you, and that's what they did.
Yeah, so after Waukesha, where did you
Okay, then I took a job. I was coaching 3 sports at Waukesha and teaching 5 classes, and with no prep time. And I didn't want to do any more of that. I was coaching cross country, track, and basketball, and that was how I got the job, really, and decided to shift. So then I took a job at a school which no longer exists, but in Elm Grove. And from that job, 3 years later, it turned into Brookfield High School was planned and developed. Brookfield High School and Nicolay on the far northeast side were the 2 first high schools built in the post-war era. They were the first high schools that had been built in anywhere around here for many years. And then I took the job there at Brookfield High School, and then eventually went to Brookfield East, etc.
Yeah, weren't you on the original faculty?
Yeah, I was on the original faculty at Brookfield High School and the original faculty at Brookfield East when that got built, which was 6 years later.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you coached basketball. Didn't you play basketball at UWM?
Yes, I played basketball at Washington High School, which was a high school that I went to in a neighborhood that's on Sherman Boulevard and Center Street on that. You see where the football field is on that corner. And I played there and then played in service. I didn't expect to make a college team, but I had been in service, and I played on 2 years of service basketball when I was your age, Joe, and your age, Zach. And so then I guess I matured enough, and I then played at UWM and went on from there. And these were pictures that I have of that. This was one of them, and that's how different I looked in that time. And so okay, and various things. Here's a program from that era, and what they did was to, I don't know if this is in this. No, they didn't put heights in here, but I was 5'9.5" max. But that's not very far different than Marcus Howard is this year. You know, I scored 51 points last night before last. But, and they would put me in the program at 5'11", and I was really 5'9½", but they did that in order to scare the other team, I guess. Can't think of why else they would have. So, but they didn't scare him, by the way. So,
I
okay.
guess just like you're saying how available jobs were, but going back in those time, like you mentioned how wages
Yeah.
were really low. Did you ever like participate or watch like any like strikes, or like was that big like around the news ever? Any big strikes that you remember?
No, I remember them occurring in the area, but and I can remember occasionally small strikes. I'd see people walking the street, but the largest strikes that I remember in that era was at a company which was the largest in the Milwaukee area. It was called Allis-Chalmers in West Allis, and that was a strike that was very contentious. There were minor riots that were associated with it and so forth, but they were never anything that I was near to. My father was not in. My father had worked during the war. He took a wartime job, and he worked at Allis-Chalmers. But then the strike started after the war, and at that point his war plant had been closed, and he left. So he was not part of it. So it never affected our family directly, but they were very obvious. So
Yeah, so getting more towards like 50s and 60s, you were a professional in raising a family.
right.
Do you remember like the beginning of the civil rights movement, like
Oh.
Father Grappi?
Oh yes, absolutely. Father Grappi was in the paper every day, and the group, because they marched, for example, across the 16th Street Bridge to the south side. They marched every day for nearly 300 and some days, every day, and protesting the civil rights problems at the time. Yes,
Yes.
they did not. They did not affect the civil rights issues. Did not affect where we were living necessarily, because at that point, your grandmother and I were living, and when your father was born and so forth, we were living off 76th and Burleigh here, which was a place that we went to after we were married, and lived in apartments there before we began to have children. And then your dad was born after I had taken a job in Waukesha, and we built a house in Brookfield, which we lived in for 3 or 4 years or whatever it was. And so we were kind of away from that. We were kind of away. We were not in a neighborhood that was affected by the civil rights issues. But they were obvious, very obvious in our lives.
Do you remember the court case about MPS segregation, Amos et al. Versus Milwaukee School Board of Directors?
Oh, you mean as to the issues, Joe, that were?
Yeah, the issues and just like the court case as a whole, like led by Lloyd Barbie.
Yeah, they were, because at that point, your grandmother had retired, so she was no longer part of the teaching system, but they were so evident to us, and we remembered them all. But they did not have direct effect on us, because neither Joe nor I were teaching here then, and we were not living here at that point. We were living in a suburban area.
Do you remember some of the like protests that like Father Grappi helped carry out, particularly like for like the Eagles Club judges and just everything that kind of did to bring attention to the issue?
Yes, we remember their existence, but as I said, we were not part of them, so did not participate in them, but they were all very evident.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember when Mayor Meyer instituted the citywide curfew?
Oh, yes. We were living here at that point. And I remember the children were small at that point. That was in 60, whatever. And even before your Uncle William was born. And I remember when they had, when Mayor Meyer had declared everything had shut down during that point, We walked out through our back, across the parking lot at the clinic behind us, and looked down North Avenue, and there was nothing moving. We went out there were no cars going by, buses had shut down, people weren't going to work or anything. We went out, looked up and down the street, and North Avenue was absolutely still at that point. So yes, I remember those.
All right. Yeah. So we were learning about a time, like in Milwaukee, like where you couldn't buy like butter or something around like the city.
The margarine.
Yeah.
We were talking about margarine was illegal in Wisconsin. And then, so people had to go to Illinois. Did you ever have an experience with that?
Yes, we did, as a matter of fact. The margarine situation, you knew what it was and why the dairy industry had opposed the use of margarine. We had a friend, he was a former colleague, and he had lived in Chicago, and his parents were living there. So he would go down periodically to Chicago, and he would buy margarine, but it was white. And, at that point, the white margarine is here. The yellow margarine he was able to buy in Chicago, and he'd bring back a half a case for us, and we'd put it in the refrigerator downstairs until we needed it. So yes, until it became a legal product.
So when you were growing up,
Yeah.
like early 30s, 40s,
Right.
how would you say the city as a whole changed from that World War II era to like mid-1970s, almost early 80s?
Now you're referring to the city of Milwaukee specifically, rather than, well, the population distribution, ethnic population it's probably the most dramatic changes that were evident. Prior to World War II, the city was predominantly Polish on the south side and German on the north side. And not that there were not other ethnic groups that were scattered among it, but they were all the German restaurants and the German stores and everything on the north side, and the same thing with the Polish stores on the south side. Well, eventually, both those, the largest ethnic populations in the city, changed. But that was a period of time from the late 40s until today of 70 odd years, and that's a long time. And of course, the populations all got intermixed, and the German populations were all mixed up among Irish and Italian and different religious groups. A Jewish group, for example. The neighborhood I grew up in was a Jewish neighborhood, but it was German and Jewish neighborhood. And so those all changed, and now the essential side, I suppose we have to say the south side is primarily Hispanic today, large numbers, and the north side is primarily black in ethnicity and race, etc. So yes, the change has been significant in our lifetime of populations.
Yeah. Do you remember cryptosporidium happening in the 80s?
Yes. A friend of ours, who's a former running companion of mine, got cryptosporidium and was totally knocked out by the cryptosporidium for a couple of week period of time. It was deathly ill, and we had been running partners and marathon together and so forth, and so we had to break our working together in that. But fortunately, our family, we did not personally experience the crypto thing.
Mm-hmm. All right, so kind of going back to when you were in high school.
High school?
And growing up, yeah. What was like, so I know you mentioned you would like go to the park a lot and play sports, but what other kinds of activities did you just do around the city?
Well, played softball, fast pitch softball, and slow pitch softball, and baseball as a kid, and then played golf as a result of caddying at North Hills, and then played golf in high school as well. And then after we had children, we began.
The dances. The dances.
Played tennis a great deal. What's the matter?
The dances. You have to mention the dances.
Dances? Oh, okay. One of the activities that was a popular activity among teenagers and young people were dances. And they would be on Friday evenings and Saturday evenings. They would be in social centers around. Did you learn about social centers and part of the school system?
Could you talk about it?
Oh, okay. Around the city, and they developed very early. There were what were called social centers were developed, and there are activities for people at the properties of the Milwaukee School Board, for example, of everything from photo clubs and whatever kinds of things, and drama groups and etc. One of the things they did was to sponsor dances, and that was in the days of people, what's called social dancing, partner dancing, etc. On Friday night was a typical time. And that even extended to the time that I was teaching in high school, where we had these Friday night dances for kids. And it was a social place to be. So it was a very popular thing. And
did you go to a lot of them?
The what?
Did you ever go to the dances?
Yeah, I went to them pretty frequently. They were also conducted by CYOs, which, does Christ King still have a CYO?
What are CYOs?
Catholic Youth Organizations.
I'm not sure.
You don't you would have remembered them. Okay, CYOs were teenage organizations and slightly younger kids, I don't know, from about age 12, and they did social things too at the churches. And I don't remember about Christ King as a child, but I do remember St. Robert's in Shorewood on east of Oakland Avenue on Capitol, and St. Sebastian's over here, and Mother Good Counsel north of your school district. And they sponsored these things, and this was a thing what we did on Friday nights. It was a social thing to do. And if they had Friday night basketball games, then you didn't go because they would overlap. But the whole rest of the year, you'd go to these dances, and that was kind of a fun social thing for kids.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we were talking about the streetcars earlier. Would
Yes.
you say those were used a lot and were pretty popular? Or and why did Milwaukee end up getting rid of them?
Why did
Yes, did you use the streetcars a lot?
Did we use streetcars?
Mm-hmm.
Universal movement around the city was in streetcars and buses for us because of course, during the war, gas rationing, and a lot of people didn't have cars, so everything you did, you went to work, went to where you worked downtown, in the valley, any place. When you went to CYO dances, this is how you got to them, was on the bus or the streetcar. No cars.
So why did Milwaukee end up getting rid of them? Do you remember?
Good question. They first of all, had to expand. The city expanded in size. There was a portion of the city of Milwaukee that expanded from, it used to end on 60th Street over here, on the other side of Center here. And when it got as far as 60th and Capitol, that was the end of the city. Well, then the city expanded in the post-war era, when the population, of course, expanded greatly. And there had to be a way of getting around. So laying of tracks and running streetcars was more expensive than opening up buses. And so buses became popular as the city got larger and larger.
A lot of that, like that expansion, annexation, happened during Frank Zeidler's tenure as mayor.
Yes.
What did you think of his, like what he kind of did for the city overall?
In what sense do you mean, Joe?
Like,
By good for?
yeah, like, do you think he like helped the city?
Oh, well, it changed the city. I help or not help. That's an interpretation kind of thing, but it changed it so dramatically. The city changed it dramatically. The area, the population had been very condensed. Population of the city in prior to Frank Zeidler's time was around 750,000 in a city property. When it expanded, went all the way out to Menominee Falls on that side and all the way out to what is now Greenfield and whatever on that side of town. The population is now about almost 250,000 less in the city proper than it was at that time because housing was so concentrated. And like the neighborhoods that we lived in, the lots were smaller and many flats or duplexes. And it was just more jammed up.
Yeah, so do you remember what kind of houses you lived in? Like,
Sure. The first house was a duplex or a flat on 35th off Burleigh, just to the north of Burleigh, about half a dozen houses down. The next was a small bungalow on 47th and Burleigh. The next was a duplex or a flat on 47th Street, a block south of our other one. What happened was, I think I had mentioned to you earlier, when the house got sold during the war, my sister and I were in high school at the time, and of course my parents had to move, and they did not want to take us out of our schools that we were in. And so they moved a block down from where we were and into a duplex or a flat, as you would know it today.
so would you say like bungalows and those German duplexes were probably like the most popular housing styles that you'd kind of see where you were growing up?
Well, it depended upon the neighborhood. The Sherman Park neighborhood, the one where I showed you before, the picture and so forth, was a neighborhood essentially on business streets. There were apartments, but in the neighborhoods they were single-family duplex bungalows or double-family duplexes, two families, and that was the primary style of home.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna go back to like the civil rights movement a little bit. We talked
Okay.
about Father Grappi, but do you have any like remembrance of like Val Phillips and her?
Of what?
Val Phillips and her influence?
Oh, remember Val Phillips. She had a lot of publicity, and of course, and we all felt those of us who were relatively liberal in our political thinking, thought of her as a very positive influence politically in the city and state.
Yeah, and I remember just like with her pushing for all the rights, the NAACP Youth Council, like for example, like when they started picketing restaurants for like hiring only like black people, I guess like in the kitchen and stuff like that, where they can't be seen. Do you have any remembrance of seeing these instances where the councils where they're picketing certain food places or stores?
Don't remember the picketing so much because during that era, we were living here, and our kids were going to school, and we were shopping and everything pretty much in Wauwatosa at that point. So that was not as timely for us as it was if you were living in the city. So I would say, did it have an effect? Of course it did, but in the broadening of civil rights. But how it affected us directly was problematic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the 1950s, there was a lot of like movement to kind of like, there's a lot of like, civic improvements. Do you remember the Milwaukee Arena or the Mecca?
Sure.
Do you have any like stories about it, or maybe the floor?
Well, that's kind of interesting that you ask. Okay, what was called the Milwaukee Auditorium, which is where the Milwaukee Theater is now, but that was all part of a theater. And we played, when I was at UWM, we played basketball at the Milwaukee Auditorium. Then in the last year of college for me was when the arena was built. So I never played in the arena, only in the auditorium prior to that. But we went to various things at the Milwaukee Arena at that point, and Marquette began playing their basketball. Prior to that point, they played in the gym on 16th and Michigan, and the college. And then they moved to the arena. Then there was the pro team, the predecessor of the Milwaukee Bucks was called the Milwaukee Hawks, and they played there. And so we would go to basketball games at the arena. And then a few years, not a few, but some years after that, then the next arena was built, and now we've had the third arena built. So it had progressed, and each time it got larger and larger. When we played, I don't remember what teams were that we played at the arena, and when I was in college, it probably held about 6,500 people for basketball. Then, of course, the arena went to 12,000. It doubled, and now then it went to the next arena, and that was around 14,000, 15,000. Now it's 17,000 or 18,000. But that's all a part of the population growth. So yes.
What kind of like events did you go to in the arena, like besides?
At the original arena?
Yeah.
Oh, there was. It was anything that would be held in a larger facility besides athletic events, and there were sports shows at the arenas. There was the circus played at the arenas. The Ringling Brothers indoor circus played at the arena. The outdoor played at the lakefront, by the way, near the circus played down there near the art museum today. And so the circus was there, and we took your father and your uncles, etc., to those kids events at the arena we went to. And then things that we went to were sporting events and things like that.
Do you remember when you said the Hawks came before the Bucks? Do you remember when the Bucks came to Milwaukee?
I can't put a year on it. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to basketball anymore at that point, but what year they came. I think the Bucks came I would say in the early 70s. I think 73 they had won a championship, and they had been there maybe for 3 years, so maybe they came in 69 or 70. Roughly.
Right,
and into the 80s for the next arena.
All right, so obviously County Stadium was a big thing coming to the city. Yeah, it cost like $6 million. Like, was the city very excited about the new stadium?
About the original County Stadium?
Yes.
Yes, it brought Major League Baseball here. And Milwaukee always had been a good baseball town, as it still is today. It's in the top 10 population team attendances of the 32 or 33 major league teams in the country. So Milwaukee had always been people very interested in baseball. So when the county stadium was built, and there was the minor league team here called the Brewers, that was of a great interest to the people. They were really excited about it, and yes, I would say it had a very profound influence on.
Do you remember when the Braves won the World Series?
Oh, sure. We had tickets for the World Series, local tickets. We had been buying tickets, I remember telling you about double headers. Okay. Well, when the Milwaukee Braves won the pennant and won the World Series, I had applied. I had a lottery kind of thing for tickets, for 2 tickets, and had to take bleacher seats because it's the only thing I could afford to buy at the time. And I think they were, like I said, maybe $3.60 a ticket for a World Series ticket. Hard to believe as it is, but that's the way it goes. And we went, I took my father, Joan did not go. Your Aunt Jane was a baby. She was born at that point in 1950, whatever it was, and was born at that point. So I took my father for a game. I took my father-in-law for the second game. We had 3 World Series game tickets, pairs, and I don't remember who went with me to the last one. I don't remember. Kids were too young to go. Your dad was not even born then.
Yeah, so what else happened in the 50s? Do you remember the old zoo at Washington Park?
Oh, sure. I lived only a few blocks down the street from the zoo. What I could remember about the zoo was there was no fence around it. It was totally open, just as if there were no fence at the current zoo on off Blvd Road. And you could walk in anytime, day or night. You could go to the zoo and just walk in. And now there were, zoo employees, guards in the houses. Some of them were closed, etc. But you could walk in. But the interesting thing was that was on the 47th Street side of Washington Park, where the freeway went through there now. And at that point, you could hear the elephants. If you were anywhere near off North Avenue here at night, if the elephants were bellowing, you could hear them in the neighborhoods. Where I had friends who lived, because I was in our high school district, I had friends who lived there, and I would be over there at somebody's house in the evening, and we'd hear the elephants roaring, from the zoo. It was the way it was, But you see, there was no admission. Those things were all free. You went to the museum, you went to the zoo, etc. There were no admissions to those things. They didn't charge admission in those days.
Is the museum that you're talking about, is that the same as the museum now on State?
Yes, except where it was. Do you know where the Milwaukee Public Library is downtown? Down the street from where you go to school?
Yeah.
Okay. The public library was on the first and part of the second floor. Then the rest of the building was part of the Milwaukee Museum, and that's where it was. The library and the museum were together, and then they were split up, and then the library occupied the whole building there, and the museum moved over onto Wells Street. So they split up, but then I don't know what's admission to the zoo, to the museum
I
now.
think it's like $8 or
Yeah,
something.
it typically, yeah.
When did that like admissions charge happen?
I think in the 60s, I would say, that's a guess, that they began charging for those things. But that's when there was change in the economic structure. People during the earlier times of those organizations, they were considered to be part of the public life. It was different philosophy. Today, you pay to go to them.
Yeah. So when the zoo moved to its current location now,
Yeah.
by the zoo interchange, what was that like? I guess, like, do you remember like the new zoo versus the old zoo, and like how is it like changed? Especially, I mean, you mentioned like there was no admission, like there weren't any fences. So I guess how did that transition, like, was it beneficial, or did people seem to like enjoy that more?
Well, people began in that era of expansion it was an economic expansion too. Today, the population, the attendance at the zoo, for example, has a lot of people who are not local residents. They're from anywhere. They're from all around, because more people travel from around the state now than they did in the early years. And so you had much more of a population that came from elsewhere. And of course, they lived outside of Milwaukee County, which had built the museum and the library and everything, say museum, but the zoo and so forth. And it was only appropriate that if they did not pay for it and buy it as the city residents did, that they pay to use it. So that's how the admissions got going. And then of course people said, sure, if you're coming from Iowa or you're coming from Chicago to go to the zoo, then you ought to pay for it. That's what it amounted to. Just have you been to Chicago zoos? Yeah, okay. Same thing is true there. Lincoln Park Zoo, which you probably have gone to, or the Field Museum, for example, or whatever it happens to be. Today, Science and Industry, for example, you pay a substantial fee to attend. If you are a Chicago resident, however, you could go to your library and get a ticket to go in for nothing. But that's for the local people because they own it, they bought it, and they don't charge themselves. Here, we charge ourselves to go. That's what it amounts to, yeah.
All right, overall, just with all the many new things built in the city, was that just kind of a great time overall to see, since you've lived here your whole life, was it great to see the city expand with so many new, beautiful things?
Well, as the early years, going from 0 to the time I left to go into service, which was then 17 years later, etc., it was a different life during that period of time of growing up. And so it's hard to make effective contrasts and comparisons when it's Francie growing up, or or today of you guys and your lives being different, and as you would look at them, I think it's hard to make comparisons and say it's better, worse, or anything. I would intellectually not choose to make those kinds of comparisons because I think they're so dependent upon the comparisons of time eras, etc., are so dependent upon your own experience. As to growing up, you're growing up in the Christ King neighborhood, and compared to growing up anywhere else, it was unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And that's the
sure.
way it was. Joe and David and Zach, you grew up in Wauwatosa for virtually your entire lives. I assume you did. Did you also,
Yes,
Zach?
yeah.
Yeah. For a little while when Joe was born, you were in the city of Milwaukee, right?
Mm.
You're right. Dave, were you born in the city too?
Correct, yeah.
Over on 90th? Yeah, okay. But essentially, it was like it was,
Yeah.
you're 2 blocks off Center Street, you were 1 block off Center Street,
Mhm.
make a difference.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
getting in, do you remember, was there any, the 1970s obviously was
Yeah.
an incredibly, turbulent time in just politics and the cultural.
Yeah.
Did you remember any, big events happening in Milwaukee, either related to, I don't know, Nixon's presidency, Vietnam War, anything like peace, love, movements?
Well, the Vietnam War was probably during the period of the Vietnam War, I was the program I was in at Marquette took 5 years. Now, it was the heart of the Vietnam era, and I got my last degree just at the end of Vietnam and here, and life on the Marquette campus, the university campus, was protests and marches and et cetera, et cetera. It was a turbulent time, I guess I put it that way. Turbulent is, it was significant.
Do you remember any like specific like protests or anything like that kind of just sticks out in your memory?
Protests. Well, there was a time a draft board downtown of North Water, or Michigan, got broken into and records destroyed. People were protesting, and I remember Marquette University students, not high school but university, protesting the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War started in the middle 50s, and at that point, that was within a decade after World War II. So the anti-communist, for example, the anti-Japan, etc. That was all very current. We lived through that, and people lived through that, and then it transitioned into Vietnam. And then after 15 years of Vietnam and 65,000 or 59,000 deaths of American soldiers had happened, and the draft and everything, there was a change in the attitude towards the war. People say, hey, what are we doing there? You know, no different in a sense than what is happening today in Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran. You know, we really think, hey, what are we doing over there? You know, and that's where we are. And that same thing happened in Vietnam in spades. You know, and of course it was worse then because we had, like I said, 59,000 deaths. A number of my students had died in the war and so forth, so I was very sensitive to it. But I, as I said, I hesitate making intellectualizing on it because it depended on where you were, how old you were, what your feelings were. But
was it tough, like watching your students go off to the war? Was it kind of difficult for you to like kind of watch them go away?
Well, not in Vietnam. In World War II and Korea, young men were pretty scarce. You know, like I said, I had a job at a packing plant, had a job here and there that all would have been taken by young men as a high school kid, loading freight cars or, you know, and walk your road at that point. Was it hard? There weren't a whole lot of young men around. If they were around, the first thing you thought was, must be what was called 4F at the time. They did not qualify for service because of their physical incapacities and so forth. And was it hard? Well, I wouldn't say hard that you felt sorry for anybody because it was just the way life was. Everybody, young men between the ages of 18 and 38, approximately 20-year group there, were in service, and vast majority of them were in service. Your brothers, you know, came back to college, for example. Instead of having everybody at college being between 18 and 22, they were between 18 and 32. You know, they were old. My brother was 7 years older than I. We were together in college for 4 years, even though he was a half a generation older. But that's because the way it was, you know.
I noticed you have a lot of pictures here. Are there any ones that kind of just like jump out to you or that kind of have a significant memory attached to them? that you'd like to talk about?
I'd almost have to sort through them. Early bicycle days.
Was bicycling popular around the city?
It had to do it. Okay, here's a good example. Transportation in the city. There were a lot of plants, war plants, that were off Capitol Drive on the way to Shorewood. There was a automobile assembly plant, and there were a number of war plants in that area. There was a bus that served the people, and it was on what's called Holton Street. It ran to the south side and ran to the north side. That bus had so many people that rode it that during rush hours there would be I think there was a 30-second headway. And a headway is the length of time between one scheduled bus and the next scheduled bus. And these were called trackless trolleys at the time. They had a lot of people. There were so many people coming off those war plants and going to them that they had to run those huge buses at 30-second intervals. If you can believe that. 30-second intervals in order to accommodate them, because that's the way life was. You know, you had to do that. Example, in high school during the war, and I played golf at Washington High School. We played at two courses that were kind of like our home courses. One was Curry out here off Capitol Drive. The other was Brown Deer. Do you know where Brown Deer Golf Course is? On Brown Deer Road. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay. We, in order to get there, because nobody had a car, to go, we had to take a bus on Center Street down from Sherman Boulevard and Center. We'd take a bus carrying our golf bag clubs down to 3rd Street, down Center Street. And on 3rd Street, we'd get on what was called the Interurban, which was a streetcar, essentially, but a big railroad streetcar, and ride that out to Brown Deer Park in order to play golf. We had to take buses from high school out to Brown Deer to play on the course. That's the way it was. Your life wound up being organized around what you could do. And that was to get from someplace, you had to be able to go on public transportation. So your activities were all close in.
Yeah.
You know, your mother went shopping, she went downtown. There was no Mayfair to go to, no Southridge, something like that on the south side.
Do you remember when Southridge first kind of came up?
Oh, sure. The family, the Cole family, former senator, and Cole's Food Store, which was also at Cole's department stores, which they have how many hundreds they have around the United States now. But that family lived in our neighborhood, in our Sherman Park neighborhood. They lived near the hospital on Chambers off Burleigh. It's called St. Joseph's Hospital. And the Cole family lived there. And when Senator Cole and his brothers and sisters sold the beginning of the department store business, and they had sold the food stores before that. Then they sold the department store business, and they went into building shopping centers. And they built Southridge. Then they sold that. Then they built Northridge, which is the one off 76th and Brown Deer Road, which is closed now. But they sold those businesses, and that was the start of them. And then Herbie Cole, who became the senator for so many years, etc., went into politics, but he had sold the businesses that he had started, so he had a substantial amount of wealth in order to do that. But that's how Southridge and Northridge got started. They were through Herb Cole, and that business originally started as a fruit store off Mitchell Street. Just a simple little fruit store about the size of something across North Avenue here, smaller than Syndics.
Wow.
You know, and it grew into that monstrous thing in 100-some department stores around the entire United States.
Yeah, was there any like certain like, cause I know that around this time there's a couple like big malls that popped up. Were there any ones like right by you that you went to?
Not really. I wasn't doing much mall shopping at the time, but the first mall that was in our neighborhood was called Capitol Court. And it was on 60th and Capitol. It was the end of the city. The city ended on 60th Street, and they were on 60th and Capitol. And they were the first mall on this side. There was another one on 27th and Oklahoma called Southridge, and those were the first two malls. And then they began to grow after those first two. And then Mayfair opened in the late 50s, something like that. And that became the big mall on this side of town. And then there were others that became, say, Brookfield Square and so forth.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I mean, do you have anything else?
I think I'm good. Thank you for your time.
Do you have anything final you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
No, I enjoyed your interview today, and you all did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
I
Thanks for
enjoyed
your
talking
time.
to you.
Yeah.
All right.